Start off by saying that today we are, of course, in Amsterdam, and it's the capital of the Netherlands. And the Netherlands was the first country in the world who legalized gay marriage, actually in 2001. And so we wanted to start off with a kind of a straightforward question to you. Are you in favor of gay marriage, of legalizing that by law?
Well, I'm in favor of marriage, and I'm in favor of the continuity of marriage. And I think it's a reasonable social experiment to extend that the way it has been extended. So, I mean, homosexuality has been around forever. It looks like, particularly on the male end of the distribution, that has a fairly powerful biological component. It seems like a reasonable experiment. I mean, it leaves open questions because we have no idea what the long-term viability of such relationships might be compared to heterosexual relationships. That's a completely open question. And we also don't know to what degree it's optimal for the development of children to have both a male and female role model close by. But my suspicions are those things can be dealt with in an effective manner. And I suspect that it's better for children to have two parents than one. Now, I think the conservatives who objected to the legalization of gay marriage had their point because they believed that the institution of marriage had been under sustained assault for a substantial amount of time, which is something I also happen to believe. And so they had their reasons for resisting further change. But I think you can make a strong conservative argument for the utility of gay marriage as well as a libertarian or liberal argument. So we'll see. And we've also developed a consensus around that that's pretty much universal across the West. And so that's how we decide things. We develop a consensus. And it doesn't look like it's ushered in the apocalypse. So far, so good.
Well, the reason we ask is because...
Please don't...
Well, we actually have a quote of you about your opinion on gay marriage and regarding gay marriage in Australia, and you've said, quote, "I would be against it if it was backed by cultural Marxists because it isn't clear to me whether it will satisfy the ever-increasing demand for an assault on traditional modes of being." But don't you think that opposing gay marriage just because it was it's also in the agenda, as you say, of cultural Marxists is problematic, and it's kind of against your principles as a principally liberal person?
I said if, right? So if you read the quote again, that's what it started with. I mean, it's complicated when you're trying to determine what stance to take on a particular issue, because it's very complicated to determine just exactly what the issue is. So for example, with this notorious Bill C-16, or perhaps my notorious response to it, those who regard themselves as my enemies chose to focus on the element of the legislation that was relevant to, at least in principle, relevant to the well-being of transgender people. Now, I'm not so sure it was relevant to the well-being of transgender people, but because I looked at the methodology that was used to do the public surveys, for example, prior to the introduction of the legislation, and they were handled in an absolutely incompetent manner. And I think, but the issue was with Bill C-16, well, was it about the rights of transgender people, or was it about the desire of a certain ideological group to write a social constructionist view of gender into Canadian law, or was it about compelled speech? It's like it's not obvious. You have to be a careful diagnostician to make such judgments. I believe that it was fundamentally an issue of compelled speech and the desire to write a social constructionist view of gender into Canadian law. And so I opposed it on those grounds, and I think I was correct. Now people could say, well, you know, isn't it rather reprehensible of you to object to the extension of rights to transgender individuals? It's like, well, depends on your level of analysis. So these are complicated things.
It's maybe good that you brought up Bill C-16 because there's also been two recent hot topics. I don't know if you know, but in the Netherlands 3 weeks ago, the first official non-gender passport was given to a Dutch citizen. At the same time, in the US, of course, the new Trump bill, which considers to narrowly define gender as something that's immutable and that's totally based on genitalia at birth, is now a potential law. So if you had to choose between these two laws, which one would you pick?
Well, if you're transgendered, is it immutable?
I don't know.
right. Neither does anyone else. And so there's tremendous incoherencies in the theory. So at the moment, for example, it's perfectly reasonable to formulate the proposition, and this is very characteristic of, let's say, the ideological types who drove Bill C-16, to say you can be a man born in a woman's body, which is a biologically determinist argument, and to say that gender is socially constructed, and to say that it's a personal choice. It's like, sorry, all three of those things cannot simultaneously be true. So there's going to be a variety of legislative responses to that, but mostly it's just incoherent. And I also think that it's driven by something deeper. It's driven, at least in part, by the desire to destabilize traditional perceptual and cognitive categories. And I see that as part of an assault on the idea of categorization itself that's been undertaken with a fair bit of success in the university since the 1970s. And so generally speaking, I'm opposed to such things. I don't believe that introducing confusion about gender identity into the lives of young people at an early age is going to have a net positive consequence. We'll see, but I doubt it.
But wouldn't you be also against the Trump bill? Because, like, as you said, it is also a way in which the law compels a certain identity upon you, which is the reason you opposed Bill 16. So how would you go about, what is your position on this?
Well, I opposed Bill C-16 because it compelled my speech in a particular manner.
Yeah.
It wasn't that it compelled an identity upon me. It was very specific in that in the entire history of English common law, there has never been legislation that required people to utter particular phrases. Now, there were limitations on what you could say. That's a whole different thing. And, you know, I'm no fan in general of limitations on what you can say, but there are certain legal limitations that are reasonable. You can't incite to crime, for example, and that seems appropriate. But it was a matter of compelled expression. And it's also the case that in 1942, the Americans decided at the Supreme Court level that such requirements were unconstitutional. And the fact that it's unprecedented in English common law history and unconstitutional by American standards indicated to me that it was a very bad piece of legislation, which it most certainly was, especially the gender provision. So here's the argument. Biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual preference are independent, okay? They're not. The definition of dependent is that there's a strong statistical relationship between them. Could be correlational, could be causal. It is, in fact, causal. It's also correlational, but it's an unbelievably tight linkage so that the overwhelming majority of people who are a particular biological sex identify with that sex. It's 99.97%, okay? The overwhelming majority of people who are of a given biological sex and an isomorphic gender identity express their gender in accordance with those two fundamental elements of their identity. And that would be more, perhaps something in the range of 95%, assuming that 1 in 20 is playing with fashion and self-presentation in a gender-bending manner, which is not uncommon. That's been going on for a very long time. And then of the people who are of a given biological sex, the isomorphic gender identity, and who present themselves that way, the overwhelming majority are heterosexual. That is not independent. It's the very opposite of independent, even though that's now the law. And then the other element is, there is a strong element of biological proclivity along all of those dimensions. Now, it's not complete. Obviously, anyone with any sense understands that people are quite mutable in their self and cultural presentation. I mean, we are creatures with long developmental histories, and we can learn. But the idea that biology doesn't play a strong role in influencing phenomena at every one of those levels of analysis is absolutely preposterous. And that's pushed very hard by the social constructionists. And I think that's reprehensible. It flies in the face of anything reasonably defined as fact. And it does no one any favors. Well, not least because you can't say, well, you're a man born in a woman's body. It's like, well, is that a biologically determinist argument? Yes or no? So what are we saying? You can be a man born in a woman's body, and that's biological, but if you're a woman born in a woman's body, that's socially constructed. It's like, really? That's supposed to be an argument? It's beyond preposterous. So,
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question to Mr. Peterson?
And please keep them relatively short.